Ivy Reed should have been home in her small apartment in Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood, wrapped in an old blanket with a half-finished novel beside her. Instead, shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, a coworker from the event agency. "I have a fever. Please cover my shift. It's the Miller Global Anniversary Gala. The tips should be good." At 27, Ivy had learned that exhaustion did not pay rent. She agreed. An hour later, a service elevator carried her toward the upper floors of Harbor Crown Tower, where the city glittered beyond walls of glass. She changed into a plain black uniform, tied her dark hair back, and stepped into a ballroom filled with crystal lights, expensive perfume, aged wine, and people who seemed to speak in the language of influence. At the center stood Adrian Miller, the 35-year-old chief executive of Miller Global. The party honored his late father, Robert Miller, who had founded the corporation decades earlier. Yet every compliment Adrian received contained a comparison. "Your father would be proud. Robert had extraordinary instincts. You have his ambition. Experience will come." Adrian smiled for the cameras, but each sentence irritated him. His father had been dead for years, yet Robert still seemed to occupy every room before Adrian entered it. By the time Adrian finished his speech, he had consumed more wine than usual. "We should remember," he told the guests, "that success belongs to those willing to create it, not those satisfied merely to stand aside and watch." Ivy, carrying a silver tray nearby, paused. She had spent nearly 6 years serving people who spoke about workers as though they were pieces of furniture. The sentence was not directed at her, yet it carried the familiar sting of being judged by a uniform. Moments later, a guest stepped backward without looking and struck her shoulder. The tray tilted. Red wine splashed across Adrian's white shirt. Conversation died instantly. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," Ivy said, reaching for a napkin. Several guests laughed nervously. Adrian heard them. His humiliation turned toward the easiest target. "This," he said loudly, "is why service staff should remain where guests don't have to notice them." Ivy's hand stopped. She looked at him, not angrily, but with the tired expression of someone who had heard worse from people with much less power. "I apologized, sir." Then she turned away. Her calmness angered him more than an argument would have. "Wait." She stopped. Adrian stepped closer. "Do you know that soon practically everything in this building will answer to me?" Ivy looked around the ballroom and then back at him. "Then congratulations." Someone coughed to hide a laugh. Adrian felt his face burn. Inside his jacket was an old ivory envelope, prepared for a commemorative portion of the evening. It contained a handwritten Latin passage, copied from one of his father's notebooks. An impulsive idea came to him. "You seem unusually confident," he said, "so let's test that confidence." He held up the envelope. $1 million if you can read this correctly." The nearby guests turned. Several phones appeared. Ivy stared at the envelope. "No, thank you. I came here to work." "What happened?" Adrian asked. "Afraid?" She started walking again, but he moved into her path. "Or is your pride worth more than $1 million? Something in Ivy changed. Not anger. Decision. "Give it to me." Adrian smiled and handed her the yellowed page. She studied the writing for several seconds. Then she read the Latin aloud. Her pronunciation was clear and measured, far too precise to be a lucky guess. When she finished, she translated. "A person who possesses power, but forgets humanity, eventually becomes consumed by the shadow created by that power." The ballroom became utterly silent. Ivy folded the page. She placed it back into Adrian's hand. Then she said softly, "It seems whoever wrote this understood something you have forgotten." She walked away. For the first time that evening, nobody looked at Adrian as Robert Miller's successful heir. They simply looked at him. And what they saw made him uncomfortable. Later that night, alone inside his waterfront penthouse, Adrian watched the video spreading across social media. Again and again, he saw himself blocking a waitress's path, offering money as a weapon, smiling while the crowd watched. Then he saw Ivy answer him. Beneath thousands of mocking comments, one sentence stopped him. Robert Miller would be ashamed of his son. Adrian closed the video. But he could still hear Ivy's translation. Power. Humanity. Shadow. For reasons he could not explain, he reopened the recording. This time he barely watched himself. He watched her. There had been no hesitation in her Latin. No surprise. No performance. She had known exactly what she was reading. And suddenly Adrian wanted to know exactly who Ivy Reed was. Before sunrise, Adrian called someone in corporate security and requested Ivy's employment file. What arrived was disappointingly ordinary. Ivy Reed, 27 years old, temporary event worker, Beacon Hill address. Then he saw the emergency contact record. James Reed, father, deceased. The name struck him immediately. James Reed had been an investigative journalist. More than a decade earlier, James had spent nearly 2 years investigating claims that a Miller Global chemical facility near Tacoma had leaked industrial waste into groundwater used by surrounding communities. Adrian remembered his father returning home from meetings with the journalist, looking unusually troubled. Robert had once called James a bloodhound with a notebook. Then James Reed died in a highway accident. The investigation disappeared with him. Miller Global survived untouched. Now James Reed's daughter had appeared at Robert Miller's memorial celebration and translated a warning about corrupted power. Adrian no longer believed in coincidence. That morning, Brooke Hayes, Miller Global's head of communications, hurried into his office. The video is everywhere. People are demanding you honor the promise. Adrian barely looked at her. Find everything you can about Ivy Reed and her father. Adrian, the problem right now is public relations. The problem is whatever connects her father to mine. His desk phone rang. The caller identification was blocked. Adrian answered. A rough male voice spoke. If you care about Robert's memory, stop looking into the Reed family. Who is this? Someone who knew your father. The line went dead. Adrian slowly lowered the phone. Across the street, far below his window, a man wearing a dark coat stood beside a parked car, apparently staring toward Harbor Crown Tower. For the first time, curiosity became unease. That evening, Ivy returned from a cafe shift and found her apartment door slightly open. She entered cautiously. Drawers had been emptied. Books covered the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere. Her laptop remained untouched. Her wallet was still beside the kitchen sink. Whoever had entered was not looking for money. On her desk, one object had been deliberately placed above the disorder. A photograph of her father. James Reed sat smiling behind his old newspaper desk. Near his hand was a stack of ivory envelopes. Ivy stared at them. They looked exactly like the envelope Adrian had carried at the gala. At almost the same moment, Adrian received an anonymous email. It contained an old photograph taken during the opening ceremony of the Tacoma facility. Robert Miller stood shaking hands with James Reed. They were smiling, not the tense smiles of enemies. They looked like friends. Someone had written a sentence beneath the photograph. Truth always costs more than money. Adrian enlarged the image. Behind James stood a girl of perhaps 8 years old with 2 braids and serious eyes. Ivy. Less than an hour later, Adrian obtained her address through the staffing agency. He drove there himself. He knocked. No answer. Instead of leaving, he waited inside his expensive car while neighbors repeatedly glanced through curtains at the stranger who looked completely misplaced on their street. Near 6 o'clock, Ivy appeared carrying groceries. She saw him and stopped. "Are you lost, Mr. Miller?" "No." "Then your car certainly is. I need to speak with you. I think you spoke enough at the party." This isn't about the party. She climbed the steps toward her building. Adrian followed only as far as the sidewalk. I received something involving our fathers. She turned. He showed her the photograph. Her expression changed immediately. Where did you get that? Anonymous email. She took the phone. Her hands began trembling. My father kept a copy of this. Adrian studied her face. I was taught they hated each other. They did. You sound certain. Ivy's eyes hardened. Your family destroyed my father's life. Adrian did not answer. She sat on the steps, groceries beside her. Everyone says he died in an accident, but shortly before it happened, he told me he had finally found the evidence he needed against Miller Global. She looked toward the street. I spent 3 years in California studying classical languages. That is why I could read your little test. After graduate school, I came back here about 6 months ago. Since then, I have worked wherever I could, while searching through everything my father left behind. For what? Not money. She returned his phone. Answers. Adrian told her about the anonymous call and the man watching his office. Ivy listened cautiously. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. The answer surprised her. Adrian continued. But someone is afraid of both of us asking questions. My company keeps old records at a storage facility south of the city. You want me to walk into Miller Global with you? Yes? That sounds insane. Probably. Why would you risk your father's reputation? Adrian looked at the photograph again. I'm not trying to protect his reputation anymore. He raised his eyes. I want to know who he really was. After a long silence, Ivy nodded. Tomorrow morning. The next morning, Adrian arrived without a driver. Ivy came downstairs wearing jeans, sneakers, and a hooded jacket. She entered his car carrying only her phone and a paper cup of inexpensive coffee. During the drive toward an aging industrial district near Tacoma, neither spoke much. The archive building stood behind a rusted fence, a gray concrete structure that seemed designed to make people forget it existed. An elderly records clerk named Arthur Bell recognized Adrian immediately. Mr. Miller, I haven't seen you here since your father was alive. I need files connected to the old North River Chemical Project. Arthur's face tightened. Those records were sealed. By whom? Your father. Adrian held his gaze. Then I'm unsealing them. Arthur hesitated before leading them through rows of metal shelving. Before leaving, he said quietly, Robert once told me some things should remain buried because digging them up can hurt people who were never responsible. Ivy waited until Arthur disappeared. That sounded like a warning. Adrian stared at the dusty boxes. Everything sounds like a warning now. They searched for hours. Technical reports described a minor industrial accident, quickly contained. Water tests were supposedly normal. Environmental damage was listed as negligible. Everything was too perfect. Adrian dropped a folder onto the table. Someone cleaned the history. Ivy noticed a crooked metal fastener inside its back cover. Behind it was a thin packet of security records. They examined visitor logs from the period when James Reed had been investigating Miller Global. His signature appeared repeatedly. He came here, Ivy whispered. On the final page was a special request granting him access to an independent environmental assessment. Then Ivy froze. The date was 8 days after the official date of James Reed's death. Adrian read it twice. That cannot be right. Ivy touched the signature. I know my father's handwriting. Her face had gone pale. This is his. Adrian photographed every page. We should leave. The return journey felt completely different. Until that morning, Ivy had mourned a dead man. Now she faced a possibility almost more painful than grief. Her father might have lived. Adrian drove directly to his penthouse, where they enlarged the signature on a wall screen. Ivy compared it with old letters stored on her phone. Every angle matched. If he survived, Adrian said, pacing. Someone altered a police report. a death certificate, and probably identification records. The independent environmental assessment, Ivy said. That is what he requested after he supposedly died. Adrian stopped. If Miller Global commissioned it, it should appear in our accounting records. And if it doesn't, then someone ordered it privately. He began searching through names associated with his father during that period. One stood out: Dr. Jacob Sullivan, Robert Miller's longtime physician and personal friend. The same physician who later signed Robert's own death certificate. They drove to Jacob's modest home on Mercer Island. The retired doctor, now silver-haired and stooped, welcomed Adrian warmly until he heard James Reed's name. His smile disappeared. Inside his study, Adrian showed him the photograph of the archive log. Jacob sat down heavily. I wondered whether this day would ever come. Ivy leaned forward. My father survived the crash? Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Yes. Her breath caught. Where is he? I don't know. She stood abruptly. You expect me to believe that? James discovered more than an environmental violation, Jacob said. Members of the board were hiding years of contamination and falsified safety studies. When he became close to proving it, someone authorized a plan to permanently silence him. And my father? Adrian asked. Jacob looked directly at him. Robert was helping James. Adrian said nothing. He could not defeat the board openly, Jacob continued. So when he learned James was in danger, Robert came to me. We staged the highway accident. James disappeared before the people hunting him could reach him. Ivy's eyes filled. My father let me believe he was dead. To keep you alive. The answer hurt, because she understood it. Adrian asked the question that frightened him most. Who ordered the killing? Jacob shook his head. Robert never told me the name. He said the person was inside Miller Global, someone close enough to watch him and powerful enough to erase evidence. Anything else? One thing. Jacob lowered his voice. The person's signature is on the falsified environmental report. Outside, darkness had fallen. Adrian sat behind the wheel, but did not start the car. All my life, he said, I thought my father survived by being ruthless. Ivy stared ahead. I spent years believing mine died because he lost. She looked at Adrian. Maybe we misunderstood both of them. Adrian finally started the engine. Then we find that report. Harbor Crown Tower was nearly empty when they returned. Adrian led Ivy through the executive entrance and into his office high above Seattle. Most archived corporate documents were stored on a private server employees called the Vault. Adrian entered his credentials and searched for the environmental assessment. Access denied. He tried again. Another message appeared. Authorization above executive level required. Ivy frowned. You're the chief executive. Apparently somebody wanted this hidden from the chief executive. Adrian remembered an old administrative recovery system, created during his father's tenure. He used it to reach a concealed directory. A folder appeared. Phoenix Project. Inside were internal memoranda, payments routed through shell contractors, manipulated laboratory reports, and finally the independent environmental assessment. The genuine assessment showed serious contamination. The public version had been rewritten. They moved to the approval page. Signatures ran down the screen. Operations, legal, regional management. Then the final authorization. Evelyn Stone. Adrian stopped breathing for a moment. Ivy looked at him. Who is she? The chairwoman of the board. His voice became quieter. My father's closest friend. Evelyn had attended Adrian's graduation. She had stood beside him at Robert's funeral. After Robert died, she had guided Adrian through board politics and told him repeatedly that he was the future his father had prepared. Now her signature appeared on document after document, connected to the cover-up. Adrian searched. Every trail returned to Evelyn. This could be forged, he said weakly. Ivy did not argue. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep looking." He did. The evidence became worse. Payments to private security companies. Orders to monitor James Reed. A memorandum discussing permanent containment of the journalist problem. Adrian leaned back. Evelyn was the last person who saw my father before he died. A memory returned. At the funeral, she had held his shoulder and told him to be strong. For years, he had mistaken proximity for loyalty. Ivy inserted a small storage drive Adrian kept in his desk. "Copy everything." As the transfer completed, the screen suddenly flashed red. Unauthorized access detected. Phoenix Security Protocol activated. The folder disappeared. Adrian pulled the drive free. They know. The office door clicked, locked remotely. The lights went dark except for red emergency strips along the floor. Then Evelyn's voice came through the internal speakers. "Adrian!" He stood motionless. "I hoped you would never become curious enough to reach this room. You ordered James Reed killed. I protected a corporation employing thousands of people. You tried to murder a journalist. Do not become sentimental now. Robert made the same mistake." Ivy stepped closer to Adrian. Evelyn continued. "I gave you your position. I convinced the board that Robert's son could lead. All you needed to do was enjoy what was built for you." Her voice sharpened. "Instead, you allowed a temporary waitress to pull you into history that does not belong to you." Adrian looked at Ivy. Only days earlier he would have been humiliated by that description. Now he understood what it revealed about Evelyn. People without titles were invisible to her, exactly as Ivy had been invisible to him. "Security will arrive shortly," Evelyn said. "Ivy will be charged with corporate intrusion. Your behavior will be presented as a breakdown caused by stress. By morning, neither of you will be considered credible." The speakers went silent. Ivy scanned the room. "There has to be another exit." "There isn't. Your father designed this office." Adrian looked at her. "What does that matter? A man secretly fighting his own board would never build himself a room with only one door." Something stirred in Adrian's memory. Years earlier, Robert had shown him the wall of books behind the desk. Every system needs a second way out. Adrian had assumed it was business advice. Now he ran toward the shelves. 3 books suddenly made sense. A History of Rome, a collection of humanitarian essays, and a novel whose title contained the word shadow. Power, humanity, shadow. The same ideas hidden in the Latin quotation. He pressed the books inward one after another. A section of shelving moved. Behind it waited a narrow passage and an old service elevator. Footsteps sounded outside the office. They entered the hidden corridor. The bookshelf closed behind them, just as security reached the main door. The elevator descended to a forgotten basement level. When the doors opened, 2 guards spotted them. Adrian instantly straightened. "There is a security breach upstairs," he ordered. "Miss Stone instructed me to move Miss Reed somewhere secure. Seal the building." The guards hesitated. Adrian used the confidence that had once humiliated waiters and intimidated employees. This time, he used it to save someone. Now, the guards obeyed. Seconds later, Adrian and Ivy were inside his car. They shot up the parking ramp and disappeared into Seattle traffic. Only when the tower vanished behind them did Ivy speak. "What do we do now?" Adrian held the storage drive tightly. "We make sure the truth becomes harder to kill than we are." Adrian drove south to an old converted warehouse, where Kevin Shaw lived among computer parts, server racks, cold coffee, and enough monitors to illuminate the room without lamps. Kevin had once worked for Miller Global before leaving after a dispute over employee surveillance. When Adrian placed the storage drive on his desk, Kevin raised an eyebrow. "You look terrible. I need this preserved." Kevin examined the files. His expression changed. "Preserved where?" "Everywhere. Adrian, once this goes out, You cannot pull it back. That's the point. Kevin looked from Adrian to Ivy. You understand, this could destroy Miller Global? Adrian stared at the company logo visible inside one document. For most of his life, that symbol had meant family. Then, he remembered James Reed forced to abandon his daughter, communities unknowingly drinking contaminated water, and his father secretly fighting the company he had created. If an empire survives only because the truth is buried, Adrian said, it deserves to fall. Kevin nodded. During the night, he duplicated the evidence across independent repositories, sent encrypted packages to journalists, environmental attorneys, regulators, and public interest organizations, and prepared releases that could not easily be withdrawn. Near dawn, the first reports appeared. By morning, the Phoenix Project was public. Miller Global's stock price collapsed. Television crews gathered outside Harbor Crown Tower. Board members issued denials. Evelyn Stone called the records fabricated. Adrian watched the coverage without satisfaction. The company his father had spent a lifetime building was breaking apart. Ivy sat beside him. You did not destroy your father's legacy. Adrian laughed bitterly. Look at the screen. Your father risked everything to save mine. Maybe the company was never the legacy he cared about most. Adrian looked at her. The thought hurt, but it also released something in him. Still, Ivy understood Evelyn's defense. Documents can be challenged. We need someone who can explain what happened. Jacob? He knows only part of it. Adrian knew whom she meant. James Reed. Using old expense records, private transfers, insurance payments, and an obscure trust established through one of Robert's attorneys, they followed a trail east across Washington. It eventually led to a quiet residential home outside Walla Walla, surrounded by fields and low hills. Ivy stood outside the entrance for several minutes before she could move. For more than a decade, she had imagined her father buried beneath cold earth. Now someone inside might carry his voice. An older woman named Margaret, who managed the home, led them toward a sunroom. Mr. Reed usually reads here in the afternoon. Ivy stopped in the doorway. An elderly man sat beside the window with a newspaper folded across his lap. His hair had turned silver. His shoulders were thinner. But when he looked up, she recognized him before thought could interfere. Dad? James Reed stood slowly. His eyes filled. Ivy. She crossed the room. Years of anger, grief, questions, and disbelief collapsed into one embrace. You were alive. I know. You let me bury you. I know. Her hands struck weakly against his chest before gripping his sweater. I hated you for dying. James closed his eyes. I hated myself for surviving without you. Later, when Ivy was able to listen, he explained. Robert had saved his life, but Evelyn's network remained active. James had been moved repeatedly under false identities. When Robert later died unexpectedly, James became afraid that contacting Ivy would expose her. Why didn't you release the evidence yourself? Adrian asked. James looked toward the hills. Because I had documents, but no safe chain to the public. Evelyn controlled investigators, lawyers, private security, and people inside the company. Robert intended to expose her when he had enough support from the board. But he died first. James nodded. He knew his heart was failing. He also knew Evelyn was watching him. James opened an old wooden box. Inside were ivory envelopes. The Latin sentence came from your father, he told Adrian. Robert used it as a reminder whenever power tempted him to justify something wrong. Adrian thought about the gala. The envelope. Ivy standing beneath chandeliers while he mocked her. What he had believed was a clever weapon had actually been his father's warning, reaching him years late. James agreed to testify. Within days, federal investigators reopened the environmental case. Former employees came forward. Residents near the old Tacoma facility provided medical and property records. Arthur Bell surrendered original archive logs. Dr. Jacob Sullivan testified about the staged accident. And Brooke Hayes, who had initially treated the scandal as a publicity problem, delivered internal communications, showing Evelyn's attempts to discredit Adrian and Ivy. One by one, people who had once remained silent discovered that silence was no longer their only choice. Evelyn's empire of fear began collapsing from the inside. 3 months later, Evelyn Stone was arrested after investigators connected her to falsified environmental reports, obstruction, illegal surveillance, and the attempted silencing of James Reed. Miller Global did not survive in its old form. Several divisions were sold. Others entered restructuring. Compensation funds were established for families affected by the contaminated water. Adrian testified publicly. During questioning, an attorney asked whether he understood that his cooperation had cost him control of the company. Yes, Adrian answered. And do you regret that? He thought of the man he had been at the gala. No. Afterward, Adrian resigned. He sold most of the personal holdings connected to Miller Global and directed a large portion toward environmental restoration, legal assistance for whistleblowers, and educational programs in working-class neighborhoods. People called it repentance. Adrian disliked the word. Repentance sounded like one grand action that erased everything before it. He knew better. Changing meant waking up each morning and making another choice. Ivy returned to academic work she had abandoned after coming back from California. With help from a university professor named Hannah Porter, she began teaching classical languages part-time while assisting James in organizing his old investigative records. James did not move back into Ivy's life, as though no time had passed. Their reunion was harder than the newspapers understood. Some days she sat beside him for hours. Other days she became angry over the birthdays, graduations, illnesses, and lonely evenings he had missed. James never asked her to forgive him quickly. That patience helped more than explanations. A year after the gala, a community center opened in Beacon Hill. It carried the Reed Miller name, not because Ivy or Adrian wanted monuments to their families, but because both believed the two names should finally stand together publicly after so many years of manufactured hostility. The center offered tutoring, legal clinics, environmental education, language courses, and meeting rooms for local organizations. No grand marble staircase greeted visitors. Children covered the walls with drawings. Coffee was inexpensive. Nobody had to wear the right clothes to enter. On opening afternoon, Adrian stood near the entrance wearing jeans and a plain shirt. Ivy joined him. "You look uncomfortable," she said. "I used to stand in front of shareholders without blinking, and now, a group of 12-year-olds asked me to judge their science projects. That is considerably more dangerous." He laughed. A boy named Noah ran toward Ivy, carrying a book from the small library. "Ms. Reed, look." He showed her a passage about character being measured, not by possessions, but by choices. Ivy smiled. Adrian glanced at her. "I still technically owe you $1 million. No, you don't. I made the promise publicly. You paid something more expensive." He knew what she meant. Not money. Certainty. He had surrendered the comforting certainty that his family was always right, that wealth meant competence, that authority meant worthiness, and that people standing outside the spotlight mattered less than those beneath it. That evening, after the visitors left, James joined Ivy and Adrian in the small garden behind the center. For a while, none of them spoke. James finally said, "Robert once told me something when we believed we might lose everything." Adrian looked over. "He said there comes a point when a person has to decide whether he wants to protect what bears his name or protect what allows him to respect that name." Adrian lowered his eyes. "I wish he had told me." "He tried," James said. Adrian immediately remembered the envelope. The Latin warning had been sitting in a company archive, waiting. Perhaps Robert had known his son would not understand it when young. Perhaps he had simply hoped someday Adrian would. Ivy looked toward the windows of the community center, where workers were turning off the last lights. A year earlier, she had entered another bright room carrying a tray, hoping nobody important would notice her. Now she understood that being unseen had never made her insignificant. And Adrian understood something equally difficult. Being seen by everyone had never made him important. Years later, the story people remembered was still the dramatic one. They remembered the wealthy executive who mocked a waitress. They remembered the impossible-looking letter, the challenge, the promise of $1 million, and the moment Ivy Reed answered in a language almost nobody in the ballroom understood. The video continued appearing online from time to time, but Ivy rarely watched it. The part that mattered had happened after the cameras stopped. James eventually moved into a small house near the community center. He never fully recovered the years he had lost with his daughter, because lost years do not return simply because a secret is explained. Yet he and Ivy learned to build something different from what had been taken from them. They stopped trying to recreate the past and began paying attention to the ordinary present. Shared breakfasts, walks after rain, disagreements that could finally end with another conversation instead of disappearance. Adrian never again ran a corporation the size of Miller Global. He discovered he did not miss it as much as he expected. He served on non-profit boards, worked with environmental accountability groups, and occasionally spoke to business students about leadership. Whenever someone introduced him as the former heir to a famous company, he corrected them gently. "I inherited a company," he would say. "Leadership was something I had to learn afterward." Age softened all three of them. James walked more slowly. Adrian's hair began turning gray. Ivy eventually became the director of the center's educational programs. One autumn evening, they sat in the garden while children played beyond the fence. Ivy watched an older volunteer patiently helping a young boy repair the wheel of a small wooden cart. She thought about how strange life was. People often imagined that the greatest mistakes came from hatred, greed, or deliberate cruelty. Sometimes they did, but many mistakes began somewhere quieter. A person stopped seeing the waiter who cleared the table. A manager stopped hearing the worker who disagreed. A parent became too proud to admit fear. A successful person slowly began believing that success proved every judgment correct. Little by little, humanity became inconvenient, and power filled the space it left behind. Adrian had once believed losing wealth would be the worst thing that could happen to him. Later, he understood that a person could keep every house, every title, every account, and still become terribly poor if he could no longer recognize the dignity of someone standing in front of him. Ivy had learned another lesson. Pain could become a compass, but it could also become a prison. For years, anger toward the Miller name had helped her continue searching. Yet if she had allowed that anger to decide everything, she would never have trusted Adrian long enough to uncover the truth. Forgiveness, she realized, did not require pretending harm never happened. Sometimes forgiveness simply meant refusing to let yesterday choose every relationship tomorrow. James had perhaps learned the hardest lesson. Protecting someone and loving someone were not always the same action. His disappearance had saved Ivy's life, but it had wounded her deeply. Good intentions did not cancel consequences. When people grew older, the apologies that mattered most were rarely the clever ones. They were the apologies that did not demand immediate forgiveness. And Adrian had learned that inheritance was more than property. Every generation received unfinished work from the one before it. Mistakes, fears, sacrifices, prejudices, unfinished conversations, sometimes even hidden courage. A mature life was not spent defending everything inherited. It was spent deciding what deserved to continue and what should end with us. The evening light faded. A child ran across the grass laughing. Adrian looked at Ivy. "Do you ever think about that night?" "Sometimes." "If I had not spilled the wine, You didn't. He smiled. Right. If someone hadn't spilled it on me, then maybe none of this would have happened. James shook his head. The truth has patience. If one door stays closed, it waits beside another. Ivy looked toward the center they had built from the ruins of secrets. Once, a powerful man had offered her a fortune to read a letter because he wanted to prove that she was small. In the end, the letter did not reveal her worth. It revealed his blindness. And perhaps that was why its message survived them all. Power was never measured by how many people obeyed you. It was measured by how carefully you treated the people who had no power over you. That lesson cost far more than $1 million. But unlike money, it became more valuable every time someone chose to live by it.